He was born in the kind of silence that felt like the pause before thunder. The world didn't know his name, yet creation seemed to hold its breath in a forgotten corner of Bethlehem, where the air smelled of dust and destiny. A child arrived whose first cry seemed to echo across time. He wasn't wrapped in royal silk, but in the rough cloth of shepherds, and still heaven called him king. No one around that manger could have guessed that the tiny fingers reaching for warmth would one day stretch wide upon a cross. Yet even then, he knew. Before his mother whispered a lullaby, before shepherds bowed or Magi followed a star, he knew the shadow of a tree already lay over his cradle. Not a cedar or olive, but a cross waiting to be raised. Every prophecy spoken about him wasn't a mystery to solve. It was a memory he carried from eternity. He had written the script before he ever stepped onto the stage of earth. But what kind of writer walks into his own tragedy willingly? What kind of God would choose heartbreak as his opening act? As he grew, the world mistook his quietness for simplicity. The village boys laughed at his patience, not realizing he was learning the rhythm of mercy. In Joseph's workshop, he shaped wood with steady hands, aware that someday those same hands would feel iron pierce through flesh. Every beam he touched, every nail he drove, whispered reminders of the ending he had already accepted. Yet he smiled. There was no fear in his eyes, only a strange calm, the calm of someone who understood that love is heavier than death, but worth carrying anyway. When he walked through Galilee, dust clinging to his sandals, he wasn't searching for fame. He was searching for hearts, the kind that beat out of rhythm, wounded by disappointment, forgotten by the world. The fishermen who dropped their nets to follow him never realized they were stepping into the story of eternity. To them, he was a teacher, maybe a miracle worker, but he was more than that. Every word he spoke was a thread in a divine tapestry, woven with purpose, stitched with sacrifice. He healed bodies, yes, but he was after souls. He laughed often. People forget that. They imagine him only solemn and saintly, but he had the kind of laugh that broke tension like dawn breaking darkness. He shared bread with those who would later question him, hugged the children others ignored, and spoke to women the world refused to see. His every gesture was rebellion against indifference, and through it all, he knew what waited ahead. Still, he didn't withdraw. He didn't protect himself. He loved harder. The closer death came, the softer his heart grew, as if he meant to overwhelm cruelty with kindness. But the more light he spread, the more shadows gathered. His words made the powerful uneasy. Truth always does. The priests whispered, the rulers watched, and the crowd, fickle as wind, began to murmur. They wanted a king who would fight their wars, not one who would wash their feet. He offered a transformation when they demanded triumph. Still, he kept speaking in parables, painting eternity in language simple enough for children to understand. To some, he was salvation. To others, a threat that needed silencing. And all the while, he knew exactly how it would end. There's a kind of courage that doesn't roar, but simply refuses to step back. That was the courage he carried. He could have disappeared into the desert, vanished among the sands, and history might have remembered him as a wandering teacher. But he kept walking toward Jerusalem, the city that kills its prophets. His disciples didn't understand. They thought victory meant escape. Yet every step closer to that city was a deliberate march into his own crucifixion. The miracle wasn't that he died, it's that he didn't stop living before it happened. Even when the crowds pressed around him, begging for healing or spectacle. He looked beyond the noise. He saw the loneliness in their cheers, the hunger behind their demands. They wanted miracles to fill their emptiness, not understanding that he himself was the miracle. The more they tried to crown him, the more he thought of the thorns waiting to pierce his brow. Yet he never resented them. Love to him was not transaction, but transformation. To love was to bleed willingly, and so he smiled as the same people who praised him unknowingly prepared his cross. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills and painted the sky in bruised shades of crimson, he sat alone, feeling the weight of both heaven and humanity pressing on his shoulders. He prayed not for escape, but for strength to endure. The silence that answered wasn't absence, it was consent. He would go on. He would show up, even knowing the cost. There was something almost terrifying about his peace. It wasn't denial, but complete surrender. He wasn't a man trapped by destiny. He was a God embracing it fully. And so, the journey continued. From villages to cities, from laughter to suspicion, the air around him grew heavier, as if history itself were tightening its grip. Each miracle now felt like a countdown. Every word he spoke seemed to echo louder, unsettling those who listened too closely. The disciples noticed the shift, but couldn't name it. The crowds sensed something inevitable approaching, but pretended not to care. And Jesus, the man who knew he'd die, kept walking, kept teaching, kept showing up, as if love itself refused to retreat. The storm was coming. He welcomed it. The whispers had grown into strategy. In the dark halls of power, men plotted with trembling certainty, afraid of the light, yet drawn to extinguish it. The priests who claimed to serve God had forgotten his voice. Their prayers had become politics, their temples monuments to fear. They spoke his name, but feared his presence. Jesus saw it all, heard their whispers, and still walked toward them. The irony of heaven confronting hypocrisy was almost unbearable. But he didn't come to argue theology. He came to embody truth. Truth doesn't need defense. It simply stands and exposes lies by existing. As the festival of Passover neared, the city filled with the scent of lambs prepared for sacrifice, though none knew that the final lamb was already among them. The disciples laughed and argued about greatness, blind to the sorrow in his eyes. He watched them the way a father watches children who cannot yet understand the cost of love. Even Judas, restless, calculating, already halfway gone, sat close enough to hear every heartbeat of mercy. Jesus didn't push him away. He shared bread with his betrayer, offering grace where most would give rage. That's the paradox of divine love. Night came softly that week, like a veil draped over the inevitable. Jesus withdrew to pray more often, as though gathering strength from silence itself. In Gethsemane, the olive trees stood like witnesses, their gnarled roots clutching the earth beneath the stars. He fell to his knees, sweat mingling with the dust, and whispered the words that would split eternity. Father, if it is possible. There was no thunder, no voice to reassure him, only the heavy stillness of a world about to change. Yet when he rose, he did so resolved. Heaven had said nothing, but love had already answered. When they came with torches and weapons, it was not the mob that shocked him. It was the face leading them. Judas, the man he had called friend, stood trembling, torn between greed and guilt. A kiss sealed the betrayal. Soldiers expected resistance. Instead, they found surrender. He didn't fight. He simply asked, "Whom do you seek?" As if giving them permission to play their part. Even as they bound his hands, he reached for one of their hearts, healing the wound Peter's sword had caused. Violence met compassion that night, and compassion refused to flinch. Dragged through courts that confused justice with convenience, he stood before men desperate to protect their power. Pilate saw the innocence in his eyes and tried to wash it off his hands, but guilt doesn't rinse away that easily. The crowd screamed louder, their voices blending into one sound, the anthem of fear. They wanted blood, and the system delivered it. Yet Jesus remained silent, not in defeat, but in dominion. Silence was his weapon, and mercy his rebellion. They mocked him with a crown of thorns, unaware they were crowning the King of eternity. As the whip tore through his back, the heavens must have shuddered. The same hands that shaped the universe were now bound and bleeding. The soldiers laughed, drunk on cruelty, never realizing they were fulfilling prophecy with every strike. He could have spoken a single word and undone them all, but love held his tongue. He bore each lash as if carrying the pain of every human heart that would ever break. The weight of the world wasn't just on his shoulders. It was in every breath, every drop of blood that hit the ground like a promise kept. When they forced him to carry the cross, the streets of Jerusalem turned into a river of judgment and shame. Yet even under the crushing beam, he looked at those around him with compassion, the women weeping, the men averting their eyes. Each stumble wasn't weakness, it was revelation. The Creator carried creation's curse, step by agonizing step. When Simon of Cyrene was pulled from the crowd to help, he didn't know he was touching history's most sacred burden. Together they climbed Golgotha, one man broken by sin, the other breaking sin itself. They nailed him to the wood he once shaped, stretching his arms wide, as if to embrace the very world that condemned him. The sky dimmed, the earth trembled, and yet he spoke, not curses, but forgiveness. Father, forgive them, he said, and the words felt too large for the air to hold. Even the thief beside him, gasping between pain and repentance, found hope in that dying man's eyes. It wasn't fair, it wasn't logical, but it was love, raw and unguarded. Every heartbeat was a defiance, every gasp a declaration. Love will not be silenced. For hours, he hung there, not as a victim, but as a bridge between heaven and humanity, between justice and mercy, between despair and redemption. The crowd that once cheered now watched in uneasy silence. The priests thought they'd won, but they couldn't see that the cross wasn't defeat. It was coronation. With every drop of blood, he was rewriting the contract of creation. When he whispered, "It is finished," it wasn't surrender, it was completion. The curtain tore, the world shifted, and for the first time since Eden, the way home was open again. Then came the stillness, the kind that feels wrong, like the pause after a symphony ends too soon. His body lay lifeless, his followers shattered, their faith buried with him in a borrowed tomb. The world that mocked him now felt strangely quiet, as if guilt itself had stolen its breath. The sun set on Friday, and hope seemed buried beneath stone. But even in death, he wasn't done. The grave thought it had swallowed him. It had only swallowed the seed, and seeds, as every farmer knows, don't die, they rise. The stone rolled into place with a sound that felt like the end of everything. The soldiers sealed it, and darkness claimed the tomb as its prize. But the world didn't understand that silence is where God breathes best. Inside that stillness, something eternal stirred. Death had taken many before, But this was different. This time, it had swallowed life itself, and life was fighting back. The universe held its breath again, waiting. Heaven watched as the author of existence rewrote his own ending from within the grave. The story wasn't over. It was only just turning the page. In those long hours of waiting, the disciples scattered like ashes in the wind. Fear became their new master. Peter wept bitterly, replaying his denial until it carved shame into his soul. Mary clung to the memory of his voice, refusing to believe that love could end in a tomb. And yet, unseen to them, eternity was already shifting beneath the surface. Angels prepared not for mourning, but for announcement. The same God who had entered the world through a borrowed manger was about to exit death through a borrowed grave. Even his endings were humble. When the dawn broke on the third day, the world didn't notice at first. Birds sang, as they always did, unaware they were heralding resurrection. The stone that men had sealed with authority moved without a human hand. The earth trembled, not in violence, but in victory. Light poured into a space made for decay, and death blinked in disbelief. He rose, not in thunder or spectacle, but in quiet power. The same hands that once healed the sick now bore scars as proof of redemption. The impossible had happened. The dead man walked, and eternity began again. Mary stood outside the tomb, tears blurring her vision, her heart torn between grief and confusion. She thought the body had been taken, that even in death the world refused to give him peace. Then she heard her name, one word, spoken the way only he could say it. Mary. In that instant, every shadow fled. It wasn't just recognition, it was resurrection for her soul. She turned, and disbelief became worship. He didn't need to prove who he was. Love identified itself. The first word of the new world wasn't a sermon, it was her name. News spread like wildfire through whispers and wonder. The disciples, once paralyzed by fear, found courage in the impossible. Doubt wrestled with belief as they saw him, ate with him, touched the scars that once terrified them. He didn't return with vengeance or bitterness. He came back with peace. Do not be afraid, he said, as if rewriting the human condition itself. The resurrection wasn't a display of power, it was a revelation of character. The God who knew he'd die and still showed up now showed that even death must bow when love stands tall. But resurrection didn't erase pain. It redefined it. The scars remained, visible and intentional. They weren't signs of weakness, but credentials of victory. He didn't hide them. He offered them as proof that redemption is never clean, never easy. His followers learned that faith wasn't about avoiding suffering, but about finding meaning through it. They began to understand why he had chosen to show up, despite knowing the cost. Because love without risk isn't love at all. His wounds preached louder than any sermon. Every scar can become a story if surrendered to purpose. As he walked once more among his friends, there was a calmness about him, a quiet authority that didn't demand attention but drew it effortlessly. He spoke not as one who escaped death, but as one who had mastered it. The kingdom he spoke of was not made of thrones or armies, but of hearts reborn. He told them to go, to tell the world what they had seen, not just a resurrection, but a revolution of grace. The same men who once hid behind locked doors would now open them wide, carrying his fire to the ends of the earth. When the moment came for him to leave, there was no drama, no spectacle to impress the world. He simply blessed them, hands once pierced, now raised in peace, and ascended not into distance, but into presence everywhere. The sky didn't lose him, it released him. Heaven wasn't up, it was within reach, written now into every heartbeat that dared to believe. The disciples stood watching, not in despair, but in awe. They finally understood that his story wasn't finished because they were now its living chapters. Centuries have passed, empires have risen and fallen, and the world still argues about who he was. Some call him a myth, others a martyr, and a few whisper his name only in desperation. But the truth remains unchanged. He knew betrayal would sting, pain would crush, and death would claim his breath. Yet he still came, still taught, still healed, still loved. He walked into the fire, not to escape it, but to show humanity that even in flames, love survives. That's not religion, that's redemption in motion, timeless, tender, unstoppable. And so, his story echoes across ages, not as a tale of defeat, but of defiance, the holy defiance of love against despair. Every generation meets him differently, but the question remains the same. Would you still show up, knowing what he knew? Most of us run from pain, but he walked straight through it and turned it into resurrection. That is why his name still stands, not carved in stone, but written in hearts, because he knew he'd die and still showed up for the world, for you, for me, and for every soul still searching for home. The story did not end at the tomb, nor even at the ascension. It began again in the hearts of those who could no longer unsee what they had seen. Yet centuries later, humanity still wrestles with the same paradox that stood at the foot of that cross. Why would a man knowing he would die still choose to love so completely? We build churches and tear them down, argue theology and forget mercy, sing hymns but silence the hurting. And still, somewhere in every act of compassion, his voice whispers through history. I showed up. Will you? We call him Savior, yet live like we still need saving from ourselves. We have replaced the wooden cross with glowing screens, traded open skies for closed minds, and yet his presence lingers in hospitals where doctors whisper desperate prayers, in prisons where forgotten souls clutch hope, in the quiet moments when guilt meets grace. The same courage that led him to Calvary now waits inside every heart brave enough to love without guarantee. He hasn't left. We've only forgotten how to look for him in places that aren't comfortable or convenient. Even now, the world stands divided between those who kneel and those who mock. But maybe that's the